Good afternoon. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut series talking about preservation, our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm happy to be your host today for our fifth program of 2022. Today we have the pleasure of chatting about history from below, discovering Benedict Arnold's New Haven house site with Robert Greenberg, Executive Director of Lost in New Haven, Laura Macaluso, researcher and writer on monuments, museums, and material culture, and Sarah Sportman, Connecticut State archaeologist. There we go. But first, I'd like to take a moment to share with you some information about Preservation Connecticut. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide private nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. Preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the State Historic Preservation Office, and we are supported by our members, donors, and private foundations. With this broad support over the last 4 decades, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office, shown here, is on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, and it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's the Eli Whitney boarding house built in 1827 to house workers for Eli Whitney's rifle factory, and it's served as our headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 9 preservation professionals and an active board of 21 preservationists from all over the state. Staff listed here are always at the ready to assist with inquiries. Christopher Wiegren is our deputy director. Contact Chris for information on historic preservation easements, our acclaimed bi-monthly newsletter, Connecticut Preservation News, our newly launched Olmsted in Connecticut Landscape Survey Project, and to arrange a book talk for his recently published book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Tribert is our Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Please contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and historic tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen, our Development and Special Project Manager. Jordan manages our communications and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit nominations, tax credit applications, and nominations to State and National Register of Historic Places. Kristen Hopewood, Development Assistant, manages all of the inquiries that come through our website, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened historic properties. And finally, our team of Connecticut circuit riders, Brad Scheid, Mike Farino, Stacy Vero, and new to the team, archaeologist Stefan Danchuk. Our circuit riders provide immediate response to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations and museums, historic district commissions, and more, with an array of preservation technical assistance, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, historic designations, and funding. These weekly chats have served as a meaningful way for us to continue our mission during the pandemic. We've been able to connect with the public and hear what's on your mind, providing more than 40 programs and reaching an audience of about 1,000. During today's program, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions directly at the end of the presentation, or contact us afterwards for a call or a site visit. A preview of next week's program. Our guest speaker will be Lawana Holland-Moore, Program Officer with the National Trust for Historic Preservation's African American Cultural Action Fund. I hope you'll join us then. And please share suggestions for additional programs of interest. Now it is my delight to turn the program over to our colleagues, Robert, Laura, and Sarah. Welcome.
Thank you, Jane. Let me share our shared PowerPoint presentation. And can someone nod yes if it's there? It is there. And now I'm going to go to slide view. Great.
Perfect.
So great. Thank you so much, Jane. And thank you, Stacy, for reaching out and offering the invitation to be with you all today. As Jane mentioned, I'm Laura Macaluso, and I'm just going to do a very brief introduction because I know you're here to hear from Robert Greenberg and Sarah Sportman, the people with the knowledge content about this really exciting local history project that I think connects us to the bigger picture in national history. So Robert will speak after me, and then Sarah at the end, and then we'll bring Rob back depending on how much time with our last slides. So what we've got here is a picture of Benedict Arnold, a character from local and national history that we're not going to do a biography of today. We don't need to do it because you probably already know who he is and how he has been painted with the word traitor throughout historical memory for 250 plus years. There's also been so many biographical publications, articles, and even in December of last year, a new documentary style film about Benedict Arnold. So there's plenty out there if you need to fill in the blanks. The blank that we want to fill in is a very particular one, right, about the New Haven house. And so we're going to talk about that today. But I'm hoping you had a quick read through these words that expand him as a human being a little bit, because no founding revolutionary member of the generation that we call the founding fathers or the revolutionary generation is one thing or another. They're all multiple things like any human being. And so Benedict Arnold, of course, was all these things. And I just want to point out to you that he really became most of these things when he went to New Haven, right? He was born in Norwich, Connecticut, but when he moved to New Haven as an adult and began his life there, he took on all of these additional roles. So this is part of who he is. He's not just the traitor. He was also a husband, to 2 wives. He was also a father to 8 children. He was a Freemason. He was a church member. And so we are looking for some nuance. And I think the New Haven house story is a piece of that nuance. And that he, like anyone, deserves that. Not taking away the fact that he did, this tremendously problematic, horrible thing to George Washington and to the cause, right? So the last thing I want to show you is the picture of the house on the right-hand corner. But we also got a couple of pre-questions from audience members, and I think they're great questions. So I put them at the top, and I'm hoping that what I have to say about America 250 and what my colleagues, Robert and Sarah, have to say will go towards answering these 2 questions from the public. So Diane asked, how does this exploration of New Haven's past help us today? So again, connecting past to the present. And a question from Mary Ellen is, why has it taken so long to excavate this site? Which, I think we can have a great and really interesting conversation about. So before I turn you over to Robert, just very quickly, if you have not heard about America 250, let me just introduce that to you really quickly, because it's important for us public history types. It is supposed to be a national platform whereby everyone who's interested in talking about and doing history, whatever form of history that is, material culture history, archaeological, history, all of it working towards commemoration of what is being called America 250, and that's the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So we're working towards 2026. And a lot of states have begun this work through their statewide commissions. And I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that Commonwealths like Virginia and Pennsylvania are already running, already going. But there's also a national platform for, kind of the big picture. America 250 is the big national platform. And I'm sorry, I forgot to put the website URL on here, but just Google America 250 and lots of things will start already popping up. So one of our public history organizations, national, is called the American Association for State and Local History. And the goals that they have recently set out about America 250, I think work really well with the Benedict Arnold House Project site, because one of their goals is, for instance, to make history relevant to every American, or we can just put every New Havener or every Connecticutter in there if you want to, right? And that connects to Diane's question again about connecting past to present, telling inclusive stories, the thing that we talk about all the time in the history field now. Inclusive means lots of things, and I think it also gives a little bit of room for those people called loyalists and traitors, maybe even. They're part of that story too, right? Increased funding for history, the number 3 on here. That might seem like a stretch, but I don't think it is. Maybe if we create excitement and projects around important topics and go out there and raise funds and do this work, then we are kind of helping to increase funding, whether it's locally or again at the statewide level or even beyond. And the last 2 goals listed here, which are about enhancing the public's engagement with history collections and history education. Robert and Sarah, this is really why they do what they do. And I think that they're going to share some of these ideas. It will just become clear when they're talking about their work, how the Benedict Arnold House will fulfill some of these goals. So that is my very brief introduction to why I think, the Benedict Arnold House site works on a macro level. It works on the micro level. I should have started with the micro level in New Haven, Norwich, all the places that he had a place, but it works on the macro level too, because it is one of our important Revolutionary era stories in Connecticut. It just happens to be one that's a little bit problematic, but that's all right. So I'm going to turn now the next slide over to early New Haven and let Robert Greenberg do his thing. So the floor is yours, Robert.
You're muted, Robert.
I'm sorry, I'm muted.
There you go.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Wonderful. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about this. I've been working on trying to preserve as much history from New Haven as possible, probably 30 years now. Since I was a little kid in New Haven, they taught me all about New Haven history when I was young. And I had a grandfather who would take me, my grandfather Simon Evans would take me around New Haven and teach me about all the sites and how important it was to remember what happened here for telling future generations. So I was instilled in that as a little kid. And that's kind of why I'm building Lost in New Haven, which is, a collection of lots of wonderful stories and artifacts and evidence of who we were and, where we are today. So I've always thought about the 9 squares and what happened here from 1638. And the one thing that I really love about the 9 square map that we're looking at, the Brockett map, is that it's probably the only city in America that you could actually tee up the 9 squares today. And if you Google Earth the 9 squares over the original Brockett map, it will come out exactly. Let me just shut my thing off. Hold on one second. sorry about that. It will come out exactly the same formation as originally laid out by John Brockett. And that's really important in the exploration of different sites around New Haven. And that is because I can zero in on exactly where something was because of that ability to tee up the 9 squares and all the maps through time. So what we did was we took a few maps here that I have in my collection, the Amos Doolittle map. I, of course, don't have the original John Brockett map. Nobody knows where that is. It's missing, but we have a depiction of it that we all know. And I have an Amos Doolittle map, and I have a General Wadsworth map. And if you put those together with Google Earth, you can see where Union Street and Olive and Water all come together. Now, again, those original maps, they're not like the Sanborn maps that we got in the late 1800s, which you will see in the next few slides. But what they do show is that the formation of the streets and the areas were very similar in today's. So what I did was, through time, studying where Benedict Arnold's house was, I always said, I've seen pictures of it, and I'd like to know, is it still there? And is there evidence underneath? And the other great thing about New Haven is that every time they dig, they're going to hit different stratospheric layers of time. You see that in New York City when they did in Lower Manhattan, and they dug down and down by Wall Street, and they found the original Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam and all the evidence of the landfill and the lives there. And then you see it in Boston, the big dig, and now you see it in Philadelphia, the wonderful digs that went on around the American Revolution Museum there, which I absolutely love. And so the preservation of the artifacts below the ground was really important to me. And so I set out to kind of wonder, could I find evidence of Benedict Arnold and even Noah Webster? And also, because if you look on the map of 1641, you will see on the left lower side where it says oyster shell area, you have houses along the waterfront. And so I figured this is an area that was developed early on in the settlement of New Haven. That started to make me think that maybe there was evidence of even earlier inhabitants on the Arnold site. So if I didn't find the Arnold site, I'm sure I would find something else there. So we can go to the next slide. Laura, can you advance these?
Sorry, my arrow buttons are not working.
We're all bouncing around a little here. Is it working now?
I don't know why it's not working going forward and back.
Well, as you're doing it, I can also explain. If you look in these maps, you see other houses. New Haven develops the land and doesn't really preserve anything. And that was one of the other things that the reasons why I've been going around town discovering stuff and trying to retrieve the evidence is because, unfortunately, here in New Haven, we're not trying to preserve what's below us. And so here you can see, I put a drone up. Actually, the one we're looking at to the left is a Sanborn map. And that's an earlier Sanborn map. And if you look down in the middle, towards the left middle above East Water Street, you will see it says lumber shed. And if you move to the right of that, you will see an open area. That is where the Arnold house was, correct. And now, the nice thing is that we can show the evolution of time on the land in New Haven through all these wonderful maps, these Sanborn atlases. And now if we look to the right side, you will see a building that was there. And that was actually in the 1930s and 40s was the Acme Tile, an Acme Tile business. And that U-shaped building is where the Benedict Arnold house was. Behind that is a parking lot. And behind that is the high school. that all used to be, an industrial area. So you can move on to the next slide. Yeah. So the fun thing that I like to do is drop all these maps over our modern Google Earth and also through drone shots. And so the one on the left side, you can see the building as it was before the building was torn down. And there was a fire there in that building, and the U-shaped building is what we're talking about here. And because I'm an artist, I went to Rhode Island School of Design, and so I'm an art director, and so I have the ability to do this in an artistic way. And that's really the fun part for me, is to make these wonderful transparencies where you can toggle back and forth and kind of zero in on exactly where something was. And the great thing is, of course, the Sanborn maps are pretty accurate down to the foot, because they have to say where the pipes are and where wooden buildings were. By the way, those are the yellow buildings, and the brick buildings are the pink buildings. So what I did was I dropped this Sanborn, actually that's a Beers map that's on the left, and that's an 1888 map that is showing where the Benedict Arnold house was. And that I put superimposed over the building that existed before it was torn down. Exactly, right there. And that told me that, unfortunately, some of Benedict Arnold's house is now owned by UI, and you'll never be able to access that area. However, maybe 3/4 of the house is still below the slab of where the building was. Now, the other interesting thing about Water Street is, because it's so close to the water table, there weren't a lot of basements there. And so a few years back, around 2005, 2006, they were doing building a site where the business high school was further down on Water Street towards the highway. And they had dug foundations, and I explored the dirt there and found evidence of the 1700s in some of the shards pottery and glass and pipes. And those I can date, of course, because I have a massive collection of artifacts, and I can pretty much tell when an artifact was from, just from my collection. And I also go to the museums a lot in New York City. So I was able to zero in on other sites down the street. And that told me that Water Street all along had these grand homes, and all their backyards were filled with artifacts that were from the privy pits and different things of dumping, their material. So on the map on the right, on this, you will see the slab that is now just a concrete slab. And again, I put the same, house over it right there. And that allowed me to zero in on where I thought the back wall of Benedict Arnold's house was. Now, the question was asked early on from one of the viewers here is, why is this important today? And this site in particular means a lot to me. I went to high school in New Haven. I went to R.C. Lee High School, and I did not learn a lot about the New Haven history then. I learned it early on at Beecher School in Sheridan. But what I thought would be really, really special was that the high school kids that are literally in that building behind this could walk out of their building and start to learn about Water Street and the different inhabitants, and to have this international figure had their house, right there in front of them. Not only that, but also the fact that Noah Webster owned the house and penned in 1806 the first, American dictionary, the first edition of it. So I thought this was a really special possibility, that if I could get these students out in the yard, get them out in the open, and start to show them that there was something there under the ground, they would start to look at New Haven differently. And so what we see in that lower right map is a drone. We sent a drone up after I opened the back wall to prove that the line of the house, and you'll see two lines in the back, those are the back, there's like a back porch to that house. And the inner part, that's right there is the inner part of the main house. And that is where I basically nailed the wall exact. If I were to draw an invisible X on the concrete, I nailed it. Now, there's a side note. The woman that owns the land, I had called the city and asked them if they could contact her and ask her if she would allow me to penetrate through the concrete and explore and see if the Arnold house was there. And she immediately said yes. And that was wonderful. And she's very excited about this. And she also understands how important it was for students to see this exploration. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so what I do when I am researching an area, I go and try to find as much data as I possibly can, written word, about the period of time when this was all happening. Now, these 3 articles are, and I have a dozen articles in the collection, but these 3 articles I researched, and the parts that I'm showing you here are the parts that talk exclusively mostly about the house and the basement before the house is torn down. And that's really important because this is written by people that actually saw the house. And so they were there. And they are in different stages of periods of time. But, and there's a lot of talk right now about, a smuggling tunnel. Well, that's really not what this story was about. It just happened to be in all the articles that this, entrance was something that people liked to show people when they went into the house. But for me, it wasn't really about this tunnel. What it was about was finding actual evidence of these humans that existed on this site. And what a wonderful thing it would be to be able to find something from them. So in each article, you'll see, and I tried to make them as clear as possible, about the one on the left says, the cellar has an immense bricked in compartments, evidently wine cellars, cold storage rooms, for imported perishable goods. And then they say, well, we're going to show you this brick cavity 4 feet high, that was the entrance of a tunnel. Well, of course, the tunnel would not exist in its entirety because now we have Water Street and then we have the highway system. So obviously the highway system has taken out anything from the harbor area. Of course, when Arnold lived there and he was able to look out from his house, it was kind of like Newport, Rhode Island, being on the shore of Newport in the harbor. You looked at your sloops, you saw your ships. Today, in order to see the water from that site, you would need a drone or be on the highway, and it would be all the way by, beyond IKEA, I-95, and the end of the Long Wharf is down there now. But in Arnold's day, where the train tracks are for Metro North and the train system, that is where the water was. So these articles explain what was the house like before it was torn down. Of course, the middle article says that if it was George Washington's house, it would not be torn down. But because it was Arnold, they didn't really care. I differ. I think that any beautiful colonial home should be preserved, and that's what I love about, say, Newport, Rhode Island, and lots of Connecticut. Drive through Connecticut, you see lots of those beautiful homes. So, on the article on the right, that one also is giving you an idea of what could be down in the basement. And so my mission in all of this was to try to expose the possibility that the basement was somewhat intact on the part that we could explore. And remember, the inside of that basement is going to be filled with landfill. So you're not going to find the actual evidence, I think, maybe of Arnold or Noah Webster or the previous inhabitants there. You would find it probably in the backyard. So we can move to the next one. Now, I have a really large collection of these beautiful stereo views. And the stereo views are really neat because this is an 1860s stereo view, late 1860s. And what we see here, and this is taken from a very high vantage point called the Depot Tower, where the railroad station used to be on State and Union and Chapel Street in New Haven. And the photographers would go up on top of this tower and do these wonderful 360 views of New Haven. And then they would sell these stereo views. So for a collector like me, I try to find every shot that was shot from that tower from each photographer. And this one in particular is really wonderful because it shows you the beautiful harbor, the long wharf, and very nicely on the right side, you see Benedict Arnold's house, the backyard of it. And that, correct, right there. And of course, you know, they always wrote how grand his house was. And you can see in relation to the other homes that, you know, some of which are still colonial homes in that site, you can see it is a very grand house, 2 chimneys, and you see the back of that porch yard there. And what's really important about this is that we're getting a view of the harbor is kind of receding now. It's starting to drift further back because we're filling in the land and, you know, development is happening, but the house is still there. So we can move on to the next one. Okay, so here is a closer view of the house from a different stereo view. And this is really important because if you look, and of course the perspective is a little difficult, you can see that there's really nothing built behind that house. And that's really important to when I explore a site in New Haven. That basically tells me that nothing interrupted the dirt behind that house. At least in this shot is showing that. Now, if you look to the right side, what I did was I also sent a drone up from the area of the depot tower. We tried to pick just over the train tracks where the depot tower used to be on Union and Chapel, and we sent the drone up to kind of get the same perspective. It's a little bit off. You can see I superimposed it over. You can see the harbor line in the back. You can see how I tried to, you know, marry the two of them together. Exactly, right there. It's kind of difficult. The lenses are different, obviously, and the angles are off a little, trying to judge from the top of the depot tower. But what's important here, and I don't have a transparency of this one, if you look to the right of that photo in the middle, you will see the UI area of, you know, what they consume now for the electrical, you know, units that they have there, correct. Now, if you keep moving to the right with your cursor, and you will see where, that's it right there. That is where the Arnold house was. Okay, now,
Oops. Sorry.
that's okay. That's a good segue into this. That's good. So now, this is a really neat photograph. My friend Tony Grieco donated this picture to my collection. And Tony is, he was a New Haven police officer, and he's the New Haven police historian. And he has a really wonderful collection of photographs. And he knew what I was doing. He really loves the preservation of the city and the state. And so he donated this photo, and here's this wonderful picture of the Acme Tile Company. And you'll see a car, and that's the U-shaped building right in the center of this picture. It's the blackest top of the building, right? And this is a really cool, this is a 1939 photograph from an airplane, and it's a detail. There is a much bigger photograph, but I zeroed in on it here. And this is really important. And this shows that the building, which was built on a slab of concrete, has a drive-through to a yard, and that yard is a lumber yard. And so now we do not have a building behind that building. And the building to the left, that was there. I don't know what kind of slab was there, but obviously there was a structure there, and the buildings behind all that, some of which are now the school, and the corner of Union and Water, that building is there today. So some of the structures you see in this photograph still exist. However, the Acme Tile building that's right there, is exactly how it was until it was recently torn down. Except, of course, there's where that black car is, the building continued in, and they made a bigger building out of it, but they never penetrated down into the basement of what we believe is Arnold's house. Except maybe there was an oil tank, maybe there was a bathroom or two in the building. So some of the modern pipes went through, some of the modern infrastructure skirted around through the building, and that's common, you know, through the periods of evolution of a site. You would never get a pristine site in New Haven. It'd be pretty rare. However, behind this building is what's really interesting to me, and that is there are piles of lumber there. So nothing was built there. Okay, and to the right of this U-shaped building is another yard, but that becomes the UI area. So we can now move to the next one. Now, through the students really love this photograph because the woman that owns the building or the site itself, she allowed students and graffiti artists to do their thing on the building. And that was a really wonderful thing. I really applaud her for that because it gave a location in New Haven for young people to get creative. And it also drew a lot of the negative graffiti out of the area because now people like, the students and graffiti artists got to go in and make their mark and do their piece. And then it got covered over by another group. And so it was this constant evolution of really cool graffiti art. And the woman embraced it. And she just basically said, do your thing on the building. But that is how I remember the building. And I always knew when that building existed that I think Benedict Arnold's house is underneath it. And I always wanted to go into the building and dig a hole. Of course, I didn't do that. But luck had it that something negative happened to the building. And isn't that wonderful for us now? Because now there's a slab. And if you look to the right, that is the actual formula of where that structure stood. And we can go to the next one. Now, this is a photo we took right after the building burned. And what happened was the building caught fire and the city condemned it and said, you got to tear it down. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to save the Acme Tile and Flooring Company mosaic, which I would have put in my collection. At the time, I didn't have a wet saw to cut that, so it was destroyed. However, I do have in my collection, and I have it next to me, lots of graffiti chips from the building. And when I show the students the story of Benedict Arnold's site, I take those graffiti chips out and they get as excited just about the pieces of the chips that were on that building. Of course, today, if you look to the right side, what we have is this wonderful showroom of tile, and it's still sitting there right out in the open. And I shot it when it was raining because I thought it made the tile look a lot nicer. And of course, you see how close the high school is in proximity to this site. So I just went, man, this is just perfect for the students to learn about our history. So we can move on to the next. Okay, so this is part of me still? Is this?
No, so now it's time for Sarah to connect your whole, which is seen on the left, with the work that's happening today.
Can I just say one more thing now that I know that this has just come up? Again, what was really exciting for me was to bring the students in. And I just wanted to say that I contacted Laura here, Laura Macaluso, and she contacted Sarah. And that is how we came to be. And that's really important to me. And I just want to say this, I am not an archaeologist, and I do not have a degree in history. I am an artist from RISD who went and lived in New York for 26 years as an art director, but I absolutely love history in New Haven and preserving it and telling the story visually. So I knew that once I had penetrated down, done this little excavation on my own and retrieved lots of evidence that was there, it was important for me to stop and get people like Laura involved and Sarah involved and whoever else is involved in it, because the professionalism, what was really important to working on this site. And so now I can give it to Sarah.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So I'm just going to kind of tie in the preliminary work that we've done, kind of setting up an archaeological project here at the site. Urban contexts are always really complicated for archaeology for a variety of reasons. And Rob talked about a lot of that, and he's actually done a lot of the background research that we would normally do when kind of looking at the potential for intact archaeological deposits in an urban area, right? Looking at the land use history of the parcel, trying to figure out what had been built there over time. Is there any potential for intact archaeological deposits to still exist on the site. So, we've learned through countless real life experiments doing archaeology in urban areas that even in areas where there's a lot of really just intense development over a couple of hundreds of years, you still oftentimes find pockets of well-preserved archaeological deposits related to earlier periods, right? So, it's really important in all things when thinking about preservation and archaeology to remind yourself that urban does not necessarily mean disturbed or not completely disturbed. There's often a lot left. So, before we got involved in the project, Rob had done the areas where he'd stripped off the concrete and exposed a couple of sections of foundation wall. So we know that there are architectural remains still at the site. And that left us with the question of, is there a potential for other kinds of cultural deposits or archaeological features that would be related to the Arnold house? We also know from the materials that Rob encountered when he did his test excavations that the cellar was filled in, and there's a lot of material, if you can see in the buckets on that slide, that came out of the ground there. And this is sort of a mix of mostly 19th and 20th, early 20th century material. There's some 18th century material mixed in. It sort of seems like the cellar was probably filled with local landfill material. So at least in the upper layers of this is probably archaeological, artifacts coming from the whole community rather than just the Arnold house itself. So they're probably not associated specifically with the house. Is there a question? I saw a hand, sorry. Okay, so just to clarify that kind of thing. So what we know is that, there are architectural remains of some nature there at the site, and there are a lot of artifacts, but they may not actually be related to the site. So what could we potentially find that is related to the site? It is related to Arnold or even potentially Noah Webster. Can you switch the next slide, please?
I would love to, Sarah, and I'm pressing my buttons as I told everyone. Yeah, it's actually feeling kind of.
There you
there.
go.
Is this the next one, I hope?
Yes.
Yes. Yay.
So, this one strategy for kind of assessing what might be there in terms of how much of the foundation remains were still left and what is the potential for intact soils around the site. And I was thinking particularly maybe in the rear yard of that structure of the Arnold house, where people may have, had, just carried out the activities of day-to-day life, where there could be features associated with like a dry well, privy, things like that. So the rear yard was an area of interest. But what we really wanted to do was get a sense of what might be there without having to take on a labor-intensive, complicated process that would involve stripping off all of the concrete as kind of a starting point. So what we did was we decided to do a ground penetrating radar survey. So Office of State Archaeology regularly works with the Natural Resources Conservation Service on GPR projects. It's kind of we do a kind of a trade back and forth for services. I do some project review and other things for them, and they help us out with GPR when we need it. So, if you're not familiar with ground penetrating radar, it's a non-invasive geophysical method to kind of look below the ground surface and see what's there. It uses the reflection of electromagnetic energy to produce images of the subsurface. And what it really is doing, it's not giving you a clear picture of what's below the ground. It's giving you data that needs to be interpreted and processed with various computer programs. But what it does is it looks for differences in the soil stratigraphy that might represent cultural features. Okay, so breaks in the natural soil, things that look different than the surrounding matrix. So if you think, for example, about, if you've ever dug a hole in your backyard or any other place, you kind of have the topsoil at the top, the rich brown. And if you dig down a little bit deeper, you get a lighter kind of soil that we call the subsoil. And if you dig down really deep in this region, you'll generally get kind of a glacial till that's more gravelly or sandy. And that's sort of just a general overview of a natural soil profile in this area. But if somebody digs out a hole and then fills it back in, even with the same dirt they dug out, or if they fill it in with other materials like trash, for example, in their backyard, right? that material in the pit is going to be different than the material surrounding it, and you'll get a different signature on the ground penetrating radar. So what we were doing was going over the project area, looking for differences in the soil stratigraphy that could represent cultural features, could represent the walls, and could also give us areas where we know that there's a lot of disturbance, so we wouldn't have to focus on them if we were going to go forward and do an archaeological excavation. Next slide, please. So what we did was, here's the project area. I know Rob's explained it previously. We set up 3 little grids within the area where the house was. And grids 1 and 2 were up towards the front near Water Street where the actual structure was. And grid 3 was supposed to encompass that rear yard. So I put that photo back up again, where you can see that the structure does have a backyard of sorts. And that's where grid 3 was located. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of the ground penetrating radar and what we found. This is what the data looks like. This is what you get when you do a ground penetrating radar survey. So the multicolored image that you're seeing is a vertical slice. So you're getting a profile of what's below the ground, whereas the gray image is more of a horizontal slice. So you're seeing it kind of an in plan view. And it requires a lot of time and effort and practice to learn how to interpret these results. I'm certainly not an expert in it. I will say that the results were interpreted by Deb Sarabian at NRCS, and she provides us the report that explains it. But just to give you an example of what you kind of see in a ground penetrating radar survey, if you look at the colored image, you can see down the side, it's in meters. So the whole thing goes down about 1.5 meters. Where the orange arrow is, you see a very clear line cutting across to that kind of gray and white. And that's suggesting that there's a very consistent level of something, some kind of fill cutting across a large area at that depth. It's probably not the base of the cellar because it's only about 1.5 feet down. But there's some kind of consistent fill down there. So that's kind of the sense that we're getting. The white box up at the top with the dotted lines, that's an excavation that was cut into the soil and then refilled with a different kind of material. That might represent a utility installation or something like that. And if you can see the blue arrow on that photo over to the right, you'll see that there's kind of a whitish gray material that extends kind of up and down in a column going through that horizontal layer of white and gray. And that is just this vertical feature and extended over a fair amount of area in grid 2. And that she interpreted as a wall section because she was getting this consistent kind of vertical break in the profile that extended in a linear fashion for a long distance. So that she's calling that a wall section. So that's kind of how the data plays out. And then in the horizontal or plan view, the red dotted line up at the top is another wall section. And she's got that at different depths. Again, it's consistently showing up at different depths over a large area. So that would be interpreted as a likely wall section. So the ground penetrating radar survey identified several buried anomalies in the project area. She definitely encountered a number of old utility lines like a buried oil tank, sewer, and some other utilities. And those are usually pretty identifiable because of their linear nature and their depth and other characteristics. There's things that you run into all the time in these surveys, so people get really good at interpreting them. I also encountered some buried wall sections and some other unknown disturbances that weren't as clear that could potentially point us in the direction of intact archaeological features. So one of the things that we might want to do going forward, if we could, and I would say that the best opportunity for intact archaeological deposits is probably behind the house, where there's been very little development, as Rob explained, and where people were more likely to be out doing things and engaging in activities, when they lived in the house. So, the grid 3, which is the one in the back, there were some areas that were disturbed by utilities and things like that, but there were also lots of areas that did not look terribly disturbed that offer a good potential for going out and doing a little bit of archaeological testing to see what we found. And unfortunately, to everyone's dismay, Deb did not find any clear evidence of the alleged smuggling tunnel in the GPR. So the jury's still out on that one. Next slide, please. So, as I said, there is a fair amount of archaeological potential here, even though this is an urban environment and it's been heavily developed over the centuries, basically. We know from Rob's excavation that sections of the original foundation are preserved. We don't know if everything is preserved, but it seems likely that it was probably filled in, and a lot of those original walls are probably still there. The GPR seems to support that. There were clear patterns of walls buried below the surface. As I said before, the cellar was probably filled with local landfill material. So while it's not giving you a sense of necessarily what was happening at the Arnold house, it is reflective of, the community in the late 19th, early 20th century. So that's an interesting, archaeological deposit in its own right. And then the grid 3 behind the house, the disturbances that Deb picked up were fairly localized, like clear evidence of a utility installation here, a sewer line there. But that potential for intact soils and archaeological deposits related to the house seems fairly good in that area. So I think, it would be worthwhile to do some testing back there to see what's still around. Next slide, please. And I think it's back to Rob.
So Rob, honestly, just a few minutes so that we can answer questions.
Sure. So real quick, to the left, you have a Goodyear rubber button from 1851, which of course supports what Sarah said. It's just landfill, filling in there. In the middle one is just the typical day of me searching. But what I really love is that brick. It appears to have been either melted from some heat or it's just a beautiful brick. And it kind of supports the idea that the beautiful brick chimneys could possibly, a base of one of them could still be there because that brick was hot, and lots of appropriate material in there. And the right obviously is a clay pipe from the 1700s at some point, and so that just told me that there are things there. And again, the behind the house, I just felt that was, like Sarah said, the best place for the privies to still exist. You can go to the next one. Is there another one? Yeah. And so, I lived in Manhattan for 26 years. And of course, I loved the history there. This is an example that I absolutely love. This is next to the Goldman Sachs building down in the Wall Street area, right across from France's Tavern. And they built this beautiful ability to see down on the original what was it, the Lovelace Tavern, I believe it was? Yeah, the Lovelace Tavern in the 1600s. And these are the foundation walls that they discovered. And they were really, really, really smart enough to build this enclosure. And I just went, man, if we could build something like this in New Haven, what a wonderful, tourist site this would become, because it would be so cool to see the Arnold House. And I figured, in my dream world, you could, Sarah had said to me, well, you have to be able to heat it and climate control it to keep the wall intact. And I went, and where are you going to get the electricity? And I went, well, UI actually has half this house. So maybe UI would, flip the bill for creating such a thing, because what would be better than this? And I think is there one more picture of this?
No, that's it.
No, that's it. So that's it. And, I'm really excited to carry this further if we can. Are there any questions?
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, we'll open it up to some questions. I don't see everybody.
We have some questions in the chat that came through from Barbara. She asked, where did Arnold's family live when he was in the 1777 Battle of Ridgefield? Did they stay in New Haven? Anyone know?
Yeah, so Arnold's family did stay in the house, but his first wife, Margaret Mansfield, dies in the house when Arnold is away at war. And Arnold will come back to the New Haven house, but very selectively. I think something like once or twice during wartime. And the second time is because he is going to sell the house and take his children and take his sister, Hannah, who has become kind of the de facto mother, and move them out and kind of get on with life. So when he leaves for war in 1775, that's kind of the last time that he will live there full time, even though his wife and children do continue living there.
Can I ask one without writing it in?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Terry with the Avon Historical. The last picture of artifacts that you showed, it looked like that pipe had a T and a D on it. Is that what I was saying? Was it
Yes.
labeled? Anybody see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it does have a T and a D.
Do we know
And
what that means?
maybe Sarah can answer what that is. I know that they did tell me who that might be.
Yeah, it's a maker's mark, and TD pipes are made, or pipes with that maker's mark are made for a very long time. So in this case, the shape of the pipe itself is actually a better indicator of its age than that particular maker's mark. But that does appear to be probably an 18th century pipe.
And I would like to say that because I've only gone into small amounts of, the areas around the basement, I'm sure there's lots more like that material. I mean, that was just 2 little penetration points. I'm sure that when we're able to explore more of the house, there's going to be much more found of that landfill type material. The question just came up about the tunnel. Again, I think that going back to the whole tunnel concept, and Laura can attest to this, the whole National Treasure movie with Nick Cage is always kind of brought everybody into that whole idea. How crazy is there to be a tunnel? I believe, my personal opinion on that is, if that part of the house still exists and it's not on the UI side of the land, if people did see that tunnel in, say, 1904 and 1902, and we're talking about just the entrance, we're not talking about an actual tunnel, the entrance, quite honestly, could still be there. I don't see why it wouldn't be if the rest of the walls are there. But again, I don't think that the smuggling tunnel is the big story. I think evidence of their existence is. But I would love to see the wine cellar areas, because I think that's even better, because he had a lot of wine, and I bet it was very grand. So that would be cool to see. Yeah, the tunnel would be cool.
Do we know, was the house built for Arnold?
Yes.
Did he have it
Yes.
built? Yeah.
Yeah,
That
he
was
did.
And he might have built, this is another part of the story, I've read some of these articles, that he might have built on another foundation or parts of another foundation. And that is what is important to me, because that means there's evidence of, say, maybe the 1600s there, if that house was old enough at that time.
Well, this has been a fascinating presentation. Thank you, Sarah and Laura and Robert, for sharing all of your discoveries and expertise with us. We'll share the slide deck and all this contact information with all of the folks that signed up today. We can send out a follow-up email with all of this information. And thank you so much. This was fascinating.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Yeah,
you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Hi.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Robert.